Thank you so much for being with Bloomberg TV today. So BNP Paribas reported in the fourth quarter of 2019 net income of 1.85 billion euros, 8.17 billion euros for the full year. We can say this was a good quarter. Let's focus on the quarter specifically, please. How confident are you that the really good performance, for example, in CIB will actually continue?
Yeah. The result for CIB is basically a continuation of what we saw in the year. And I'll come back to it in a second, but let me just picture very quickly the year. The bank clocked in solid results. If you look at the top line, for example, the top line was up 5% on the back of continued commercial drive in CIB, but also in the other two poles, and the delivery of the transformation plan. In particular, on CIB, we continued the strengthening of our customer relationships, in particular on the corporate and institutional side, leading to market share increases. And this basically leads, if you look at the metric, CIB in Europe is the third bank in a global space of other banks. So that is basically where we stand. And if we look very quickly on the so-called 3 Cs, we delivered on costs, operating jaws in all of the entities, Common Equity Tier 1, 12.1%, above 12% and a year in advance, and CIB, as I talked about. Very rapidly on the other two, International Financial Services remains the engine of growth, plus 7%. In particular, if you look at private banking, number 1 in Europe, and domestic market, it was well resilient in the low interest rates environment. So that is basically the nutshell of what it is. If I look in particular to CIB.
Let's look at the CIB in particular. Fixed income in the fourth quarter up 62.5%. Equities services also up sharply as well. Can you actually maintain this performance in 2020?
If you look at what has BNP Paribas doing very well in CIB, it has the capabilities to do industrial aspects, but also very tailored products. The bank has the capital to basically serve the clients, and it has that intimacy to really serve the excellence with customers. And so what we basically see is that we capture market share on all of those domains. Take, for example, credit, we do it. Take rates, we do it. Also on Forex. On Forex, there was a bit of a rebound because last year was a tad weaker, but still, on all three, the bank is doing very well because the bank is well positioned to do it on capital and on systems.
So obviously the fourth quarter, the markets, as you were just mentioning, the market conditions were much better than the end of 2018. Since the beginning of this year, we've seen obviously a bit of volatility due to this virus outbreak in China. Do you believe this could actually have a lasting effect on the markets and on your performance in the CIB business?
BNP Paribas is not a very good bellwether for this because our presence in the Wuhan area is basically very limited. So what we do see is we are present in Asia Pacific, and what we saw in January is we saw a continuation of business as we saw it in 2019. So that's basically where we stand.
How are you dealing with the situation with your teams in mainland China and also in the rest of Asia?
There are, of course, as you have seen in China, restrictions on traveling and what to do if you have traveled. So we are aligned with this. We, of course, take very well care to follow these rules within our employees, and that's basically where we stand.
Some economists from different banks, including Goldman Sachs or UBS, have cut their growth forecast for the first quarter in China to about 3.8 to 4.8% instead of 6% previously. So a sharp slowdown expected in China in the first quarter. Are you concerned this could actually have an effect on global growth?
Again, BNP Paribas, we are a European bank. We follow our clients into Asia and into the US and vice versa. So what we see in Asia Pacific in January is not a slowdown. So therefore at this stage we remain confident on the overall outlook of the bank.
Are you less worried about the virus then than, for example, the trade war or some geopolitical uncertainties we may have this year?
It's like every year has its issues, and the issues are always different than what you anticipate. The really important point is to be agile, to be able to interact, to position, to have, of course, our employees safe, and that's basically what we continue to do.
In the fourth quarter, French retail is up 1%. However, French growth contracted in the last quarter for the first time since President Macron's election, mainly due to the strikes and protests we've seen over the pension reform in France. Did you actually feel this impact?
If you look at our results, you basically see a strong continuation of what is happening. Every time, in every place, and every year there is a quarter where there are some concerns, but that's typically what is if you look at the total year, that basically get faded out.
So do you have any concerns about the outlook for domestic markets and especially a French retail bank going forward?
If you look at what basically all the economists foresee in the main countries in which we are present, you see a continued growth. And so that is basically what we are well positioned to accompany because we have the capital, we have the skills, we have the services.
You mentioned in your statement that the adjustments of monetary policies in the summer of 2019 have actually helped the environment to mitigate the effect of negative rates. Do you think tiering is actually helping to mitigate those effects?
To clarify, what it is that last time when the interest rates were moved, at that time tiering was introduced. And so that tiering basically somewhat fought that drop. However, all the other activities, the movements that happened over the summer, they are not compensated and they basically weigh on the business. But
the Banque de France governor says this will actually diminish the cost for French banks up to 800 million euros this year. So is this not the case? There's two things. So the impact of that, as I said, is basically the impact of that is compensating the effect of the lowering of the rates that happened in September. And so that's it. So there is a positive impact, but there was also a negative impact. However, the other negative impacts that happened earlier in the summer, they don't have a compensating effect. You can't really pass on those impacts on French clients, right? At the rates at zero, we basically stay at the rates at zero. But can you actually pass on the impact elsewhere in Europe to some other clients? As we said, for our retail and individual customers, we basically don't go into negative territory. We are at zero. What about the corporate client side? If you take the institutional clients, there we are basically charging because the money they have, it's not considered as an investment, so that's a different stance. Don't you think in this context it's actually a good time for a cross-border consolidation? We heard, for example, recently from the ECB, Andrea Enria, saying that he will try to remove some of the barriers to these cross-border deals. So do you think it's time? We are a pan-European bank and we want to continue to grow, but we don't need branches to do this. We have services, we have distribution channels, so that's fine. So if there is an advantage from what the ECB is saying on Europe, it will definitely also be a benefit for us, but it doesn't incite us to do an acquisition of branches and the likes. So we stay where we are. So do you think regulators have to do more in order to really allow these cross-border mergers to possibly happen? The concerns that we observe with respect to cross-border, it is indeed on a regulatory point. It's not necessarily from a supervisory point. So there is the question on saying, is liquidity, can it be transferred? Is it so that the products are similar between one country? If you go into a large country, your rules for mortgages are the same. In Europe, they are very different between each country. So that is why there is still a lot on the regulatory side to evolve for that to become realistic. Brexit has finally happened just a few days ago. Are you in the process of moving some staff in Europe? We have always been prepared. We were prepared a year ago when in March there was uncertainty of what could happen. So we are still prepared. Now there is discussion going on in what will be the end form. For BNP Paribas, the main reason why we are in the UK is to serve local clients. Yeah, we are in car leasing, insurance, all these activities which are locally. So if
the rules are ironed out correctly, we will stay and we are present and we're very well positioned to help our UK clients.
So there's a movement at the moment. You're still in a wait-and-see attitude?
We have to wait until the rules are clarified for what it means and if basically the standard transactions can continue in the UK, which I assume they will.
Finally, one big subject, obviously, recently has been sustainability and ESG. In November, BNP Paribas said it would exit from coal in Europe by 2030 and globally by 2040. How much pressure from investors do you have in order to make ESG the number one priority?
If we take a step back, if you look at banking, what is really banking need to adapt? It needs to adapt versus the customers, and that it basically does through digital. But it also has to adapt versus society, and that's basically what it does through CSR. And BNP Paribas has really been on the vanguard of all this. Remember the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations? We are basically on the basis of developing these things. And that is what we do. And so we basically be pushing this, we continue to push this, and what we do now see is that the clients are really pushing for it, the investors are pushing for it. So it's really picking up steam in what we do.
Are you going to have to improve your disclosures soon?
It's one of the things that if you look at the so-called Pillar 3, which is what banks are doing, so the capital restrictions, then there is also this Pillar 2, and the Pillar 3 is what has to be disclosed. And so it's possible that these things evolve. We'll have to see.
Mr. Machenil, thank you so much for being with Bloomberg TV today.
My pleasure.